William Robertson and the commitment and the British commitment to the Western Front. Good evening to you all, or good afternoon or good morning if you're watching this at a different time. Robertson is most usually remembered as the only man so far ever to have risen from the very bottom rank of a private to a Field Marshal. The problem with this in historical terms is sometimes that it is a precursor to a rather crisp judgment from historians saying that he was taciturn, grimly determined opponent and stooge for Haig, which is less flattering. And so the bit about his enormous success in rising up through the ranks is used as a sort of a little bit of a caveat. What I want to present to you is a much more positive image of Robertson than this grim, taciturn figure that he is often portrayed at. He was universally known as Wully, although he wasn't Scottish. He was born in Lincolnshire, the son of the jobbing postmaster and the local school mistress. There are 4 points here I'd like to make about him that summarise what I hope we're going to get out of the next hour or so. He rose overwhelmingly because he was a specialist general staff officer. He was probably the best strategist that the British produced in the first 20 years of the 20th century. In 1915 and 16, he managed to restructure the way the British conducted their strategic decision-making. He didn't just change the strategy, he changed the whole of the way they restructured it, the way they managed it. And we'll focus a lot on that because although he's kind of most known for the various bum fights he had with Lloyd George in 1917, at that point, he was largely defending what he'd won in 1915. So we shall focus on what he did in 1915, after which he then dominated, not controlled, but dominated British strategy or British military strategy. And what this should show up is that why he justifies this title of being the big brain in the army. Sir Frederick Morris was a man who worked with him very closely, and it was his description. But earlier in the decade, he'd been described as the cleverest man in the army. So those are the kind of main things we're going to try and capture over the next hour or so. Now, unlike any other general in the First World War, any other officer, Robertson had this backstory that was just so much more deep than anybody else's. All the other top generals, you know, they'd been to Haileybury or Eton, then they'd gone to Sandhurst, and then they went into the regiment. Smith-Dorrien at least had escaped from Isandlwana, but Robertson has this whole backstory. He joined the army in 1877 as a 17-year-old. You can join till 18, so the recruiting officer faked his age and made him 18, and that stayed his army age for the rest of his career. So he got his pension 5 months early as well. His parents were utterly disappointed that he'd chosen that as a career. He was the brightest of the six. They had high hopes for him. They thought he might become an article clerk somewhere. And the army was such a low status occupation that it was a real disappointment to them, to the point that Mrs. Robertson, who I guess was not to be trifled with, Mrs. Robertson wrote a letter to him saying, "Rather we buried you than be in a red uniform." He moved steadily up the ranks, and by the age of 25 was a troop sergeant major serving in Dublin. At that point, he decided to take the plunge and apply to become an officer. Now, he'd been thinking about this for 2 or 3 years, and in fact had already turned down 2 opportunities to do it. Now, there were 3 hurdles he had to cross to become an officer. The first one was that he had to pass the competitive examinations that had been introduced for the first time in 1871. They were fairly straightforward. He was a clever bloke. He passed those quite easily. And it was also rather bad form for one regiment to reject a candidate put up by a different regiment. He had to get the approval of his commanding officer, both his last two commanding officers were very keen for him to go forward, but that was no guarantee you'd always have a commanding officer who felt that way. But the third reason, and the biggest single reason that would stop him doing this, was the consequences if he became an officer and then failed to be able to financially support himself afterwards. He would be on about just under £200 a year as a young officer. He calculated the lifestyle of an officer and the requirements of being an officer in the mess and all the rest, and he was a cavalryman as well, which was more expensive, was about £500. In fact, to be in one of the expensive regiments, you needed £1,000 a year. So he actually underestimated. It all hung on getting a posting to India, where the living was that much cheaper. But he did pass his exams, and after considerable agonizing, which involved a series of letters to his father, as he dwelt long and hard on the humiliation that could follow if he sunk into debt, was ostracized, was blackballed. He'd heard of officers committing suicide. So it was a huge step for him. Getting through the exams was the easy bit. But he goes to India in 1888 and promptly sets about learning languages. Robertson was a master of languages. He learned 6 Indian languages, and each of those earned him extra income that enabled him to keep his head above water. The big move for Robertson wasn't actually becoming an officer. It was shifting into intelligence work in 1892 in northern India. That was where he really excelled, and he promptly moved very swiftly through the next tier of ranks, captain and then on major. He went to the Staff College at Camberley, where he excelled. He was the first ex-ranker. And after his stint at Camberley, was headhunted into intelligence department in the War Office. Brief stint in the Boer War before coming back to be a colonel in the expanded intelligence department, and then in the new General Staff that was created in 1904. Now, it's all very easy to take a very Whiggish view of this story. The Victorians bring in a reform. In this case, they dispense with purchasing of commissions, officers' commissions, and bringing competitive examinations, and the bright working class or lower middle class boy is able to become an officer. But it actually wasn't like that. The number of ex-rankers who managed to become officers declined quite steadily throughout the 19th century. It was about 23% in the 1830s. By 1900, it was 2%. It was about 7% in Robertson's year. The reason for this was that an officer who had purchased his commission could sell it and retire on the earnings. Now he had to wait for his pension, which meant it was dead man's shoes. And the officers in the British Army in the late 19th century got older and older and older. You just have to look at who went out to fight in the Boer War to see that. So this was not a case of, Britain getting better, the bright boy coming through. The key thing for Robertson was his shift into intelligence work, because what the Boer War showed up was how poor was our intelligence facility and how we badly needed a proper general staff. There was no planning, there were no maps. So consequently, when he arrived as the bright boy in the intelligence department, he was pushing against a widening area of opportunity. In 1903, 1904, Viscount Esher carried out a series of reforms on behalf of the government in which he removed the old leadership and brought in new leadership and created a proper general staff. The general staff that he wanted high caliber. So he asked the Times journalist Repington to advise him of the 30 officers that were in the general staff who was any good. And Repington came back saying, well, frankly, there's 18 that are rubbish and I wouldn't employ. And there are 12 that are good. The 12th was incidentally Milne, who went on to command in Salonika, but at number 1, and by some way, was William Robertson. So he was the star of the sort of general staff world, at a time when the country was short of good officers of that caliber. Now, it's very easy to, again, to see this as a very good news story, but at the same time, Robertson was twice rejected for a divisional command, which he badly wanted, in 1907 and in 1913. And so you might conclude from that the bright working class lad has worked his way up, but they won't let him command soldiers. That's reserved for upper middle class boys. And you may well be right about that. But the alternative explanation is that actually the army spotted a round peg for a round hole, that he was the best general staff officer in the British Army at the time. By the outbreak of war, Robertson was Director of Military Training, which is right at the top table. His predecessor had been Henry Rawlinson, and his predecessor had been Douglas Haig. So he was right at the top table. So now we come to Robertsons War. And before we do that, we have to kind of look at some basic principles that underpinned what Robertson was all about. And the first one was that war is a one-man show. He wrote this in the midst of the strategic crisis at the end of 1915 to his predecessor as chief of the Imperial General Staff, as a way of identifying what was a key principle in the restructuring that he was proposing. Now, it was the kind of little sort of aphorism that used to drive Lloyd George bonkers, because Robertson was very fond of these pat little expressions, which he repeated endlessly, and Lloyd George came to see as platitudinous. But actually, this little expression sums up quite a serious principle and a group of ideas. What he was basically saying is you need a clear-cut decision-making process with one person responsible at each level down the system, or else you'll not get the decisions you want. He was a firm believer that unless you had the right structure, you wouldn't get the decisions you want. And we will see that once Robertson gets a new position, and he's promoted 3 times in the course of the war, that he makes it as a condition of his taking the job, that he has some kind of restructuring work to meet his requirements. It was a core principle in Robertson's thinking, and it was one that was to lead him to resign in the end. The second principle is obviously a bit of a standard statement which could apply to almost any British general in the 1914-18 war, that the way to win the war was to defeat the main enemy, Germany, in the decisive theatre, Europe, and that meant a commitment to the Western Front. This was standard theory for all British General Staff officers. As far as Robertson was concerned, all you did if you relocated the main fighting front to Gallipoli or Salonika, you still had the same problems. You still had barbed wire, machine guns, heavy artillery, and the same static front. All you'd done was extend your logistical chain by a couple of thousand miles and end up killing Bulgarians, Austrians, Turks, but no Germans. And so he stuck strictly to this principle. And obviously this is what led him into these endless arguments with Lloyd George. The third one is quite a difficult one. Robertson was intensely loyal to the army. It was the institution that had made him. It was a thing he understood intimately. The one good thing that Lloyd George was prepared to concede that Robertson had was an intimate knowledge of the workings of the army. And because he felt the army was the core of this war-winning exercise and it was the core of the country, his belief was the army must at all times stay united whenever confronted by, in particular, the politicians. That meant, and if, as far as he was concerned, the British Constitution was something that come or go, but the army was there forever. And that meant sticking by Haig through thick and thin. The army must remain united was a core principle, and that made life quite difficult for him in 1917. And the fourth principle is one that he failed on. in the years before the war, there were the four successive commandants of the Staff College were Rawlinson, Henry Wilson, William Robertson, and Launcelot Pugell, all big senior characters in the war. And at that time, there was quite a live discussion going about exactly where the dividing line was between soldiers and politics. And in that debate, Robertson took probably the most conservative stance. He felt that essentially the politicians decided policy and the soldiers did the implementing. And so the coursework in the Staff College focused very much on implementation. But obviously that's fine in theory, but if you're sitting there and seeing the politicians making a bit of a mess of it, and you can see they're creating the wrong policies in order to win the war, then essentially you step over the line into the politics part of the arena. And that's actually what Robertson did with the deal he struck with Kitchener in 1915, which we shall look at. He effectively trod on politicians' territory. Now, what did he do when the war started? Well, he was expecting to be kept in the UK because he was Director of Military Training, and that was where that position was supposed to be located in the event of the BEF going to France. But instead, he was appointed, to his surprise, and at the last minute, Quartermaster General. Now, sadly, I can't find a map which has both the retreat of the BEF and the towns of Le Havre and Le Mans on it. But as soon as Robertson gets to France, he insists on the total supply line being under the Quartermaster General's position. That's him. Everything from the ports to the front is under the Quartermaster General. When he arrived, it was actually, there was a shared responsibility. It was his first bit of restructuring. He also insisted that instead of using Boulogne as the main port of disembarkation, he wanted it shifted to Le Havre. And that was because Robertson almost uniquely thought the BEF would be in retreat and that Boulogne would not be secure. So everything was shifted down to Le Havre, which was set up and made ready for access of supplies. And as you can see, that made a dramatic difference to the supply line to the British Army by the time it reached the end of its retreat. What they did was they set up a sort of hub at Le Mans and did it in two stages from Le Havre, Le Mans, and then into the Aisne where the BEF was based. Had they just been coming through Boulogne, their whole supply line would have been obviously considerably threatened. Robertson was pretty much the only officer, Haig, I guess, maybe, who was without criticism during those early months of the war. Even as early as October, he was being singled out for praise, and they were discussing him becoming chief of the Imperial General Staff. But instead, a different opportunity opened up for him. The chief of staff to the BEF, a chap called Archibald Murray, his health had failed, and for as well as regards Kitchener and Asquith, they wanted to appoint Robertson to replace him. But in December 1914, Sir John French, in charge of the BEF, offered the position to his sub-chief of staff, Henry Wilson. Henry Wilson was utterly unacceptable to Asquith in particular, but also to Kitchener because he was serially disloyal. And so in the end, they basically forced French against his will to take Robertson. Robertson was not the man that French wanted. One can reasonably assume that this was a class issue. Robertson initially turned it down. He'd already realized just how changeable, how quixotic French was, and thought he'd rather stay where he was as Quartermaster General, or at least he could run his own show. But in the end, French insisted, and at the end of January 1915, he became Chief of Staff. And as a condition of taking the job, he insisted on a complete restructure, bringing in his own people, and insisted that they kick out Henry Wilson. I can't stand that Henry Wilson, he said. So Robertson is now the Chief of Staff to the BEF. And one of the sort of major historians of Robertson and his career, a chap called John Spencer at Wolverhampton University, argues that this was a very frustrating year for Robertson. I find this a difficult judgment to go along with, because actually it was a phenomenally successful year for Robertson. This was actually the key year. He's promoted twice. The second time to the very top job, Chief of the Imperial General Staff. He forces a restructuring on the government, which is a major success. Kitchener is sidelined, which was an important part of the restructuring process, and the General Staff was recreated. Now, with the outbreak of war, most General Staff officers were desperate to be in the action for what they thought would be a short war. So consequently, they all made their excuses and headed back to their main regiment, leaving no impartial, qualified advice to be in London. Kitchener then made matters worse by completely sidelining them and running it as a one-man show. Asquith was not a fan of this. He wanted that independent source of advice that came with a qualified General Staff. It didn't help also that probably two of the more experienced General Staff officers, Robertson himself and Henry Wilson, were both in France as well. But what Robertson was able to do in early 1916 was recreate a good, high-quality General Staff. He then forced the government to commit to the Western Front and also to attrition as a strategy. So really big successes that were to last the war. But the one failure was his attempts to persuade Haig, in particular, to conduct BEF offensive operations using a more step-by-step offensive approach than the breakthrough approach that Haig tended to favour. Robertson's analysis of the Western Front was that it was like a fortress, so it would take siege methods to overcome. This was not an uncommon metaphor. Haig used it in some letters to his wife in October 1914. Kitchener used it in cabinet meetings in 1915. The idea that the trench lines were a fortress was quite common. The realization that they would have to use gradual siege methods was also quite common. What Robertson added to the party was that he appreciated that behind the German lines, there was no citadel, no strong point that the Germans must absolutely defend, in which case the Germans could just plug any gaps and retreat a little bit. The lines were actually more like an elastic band. And that was his basic appreciation. This is a piece of 1917 EPA, before anybody queries that it's not 1915. But he said that this line is essentially an elastic band. Now, for most of the war, with two sort of noted exceptions, Ober's Ridge in May 1915 and the northern half of the Somme on July the 1st, the British were always able to get their forces across no man's land and break into the German first or second lines. At that point, leadership would break down because officers would have been amongst the higher casualties when they crossed the front to across no man's land. And also the soldiers would tend to feel, well, we've done our bit, we're not going to push on at great risk, we'll just hang around here. But also, obviously, the Germans would mount serious counter-battery fire. There would be an inevitable German counterattack, and the attack pretty much every time stalled. That was the British experience for a large part of the First World War. The distance at which they got before they stalled changed, but basically it stalled. Now, Robertson's answer to this was that because there is no citadel, you can, in fact, locate your offensive pretty well anywhere on the front line you like, as long as you can find somewhere that's good for your own artillery. And that was the key determinant. This was not about some objective beyond, like railway lines or submarine pens. It was about things on your side of the line, where you could locate your artillery. You'd bombard, you'd break in, you'd bring up the artillery, you'd repeat the exercise. This was a sort of bite and bite strategy. But he was at no stage able to persuade Haig that this was the way forward. And all the British attacks in 1915 were based on an attempt to get through one or two lines or beyond. Now, what Robertson did do, though, was that what he felt the way he was driven towards attrition as the approach was that before the war, the aim was to divert troops, enemy troops, away from the place you were going to attack to make it as weak as possible. Now that had reversed, and you wanted to bring your enemy's troops into the area you're attacking in order to kill lots of Germans and wear them down. Towards the end of the year, he kind of moved it on a bit and said that this stage could be followed then by an attack elsewhere in the line that had been weakened as a result of drawing troops in. And that did get some purchase with Haig and Joffre. What happens, though, to Robertson is that he changes tack. He changes tack completely in July 1915. There are four sort of considered documents in the National Archives, which Robertson wrote to his boss, Sir John French, saying, these are the four documents that sum up what I think. The first three are all about how to fight the war, the stuff I've just been talking about. The last one is all about strategy, because by the early autumn 1915, Britain was in a real strategic mess, probably in some ways in its worst position strategically for the course of the war. In 1918, they knew what they had to do. They had to beat the Germans. But the problem in 1915 was they didn't know what to do. And this is the list of the things that were all going wrong. There was deadlock on the Western Front, fairly obviously. In July 1915, the cabinet had agreed no more attacks on the Western Front until Kitchener has built up his army. Within 6 weeks, Kitchener reverses that, commits to the attack at Loos. The attack at Loos is a failure. Yet one more failure is chalked up. We stumbled into Gallipoli, and the second attack at Suvla Bay was extremely badly managed, and that made Asquith particularly angry. We'd got a load of troops at Salonika, and nobody knew quite what for. But the straw that broke the camel's back in terms of the government was when the Germans invaded Serbia, or the Austrians and the Germans invaded Serbia, and Kitchener, as their chief military advisor, Secretary of State for War, had no knowledge of it at all. The members of the government were reading about it in the newspapers before Kitchener had learned anything about it. Now, if you add into the pot that we were suffering a continual manpower crisis throughout this time, about 15% of engineers had joined up. So what big reason for the shell crisis was Britain didn't have the engineers to make the armaments. Munitions were short, and there was a financial crisis in the offing. By 1915, about half the ammunition being supplied to the BEF was being made in America, and our dollar reserves over in America were running very low. But the failing was not just a list of issues that had gone wrong. There was a human issue involved, that the government and every single member of it had lost complete confidence in Kitchener as in the role of chief military advisor. He was a nightmare to work with. He didn't delegate, tried to do everything himself with the assistance of a couple of secretaries. He wouldn't tell them anything. He never gave them an appraisal of the military situation. He wouldn't turn up to meetings and threaten to resign if they made him. He wouldn't tell them things saying, "You'll only tell your wife, so I'm not going to tell you." He was a nightmare to work with. And of course, he was the only military advice they were getting. And he'd been caught out several times now. As a result, the strategic decision-making became confused. There was a war committee, which was oversized, called the Dardanelles Committee. They would discuss an issue. It would then be passed back up to the cabinet. The cabinet would discuss the issue. This is the exact opposite of a one-man show. And the way this expressed itself was that the cabinet was utterly divided about what to do next. Now, this question of what to do strategically is often expressed as Easterners versus Westerners. The Westerners were those focused on fighting in France and Belgium. The Easterners preferred Turkey or the Balkans, or even Italy when they came into the war. But actually, as Hugh Strawn has said recently, he'd like to consign Westerners versus Easterners to the dustbin of history. And the reason for that is that pretty much everybody in the cabinet was both an Easterner and a Westerner at the same time. So it doesn't help very much. All of them realized that in the end, Germany was going to have to be beaten in France if the war was to be won. Lloyd George said this in a meeting with Repington, the Times journalist. In the end, we're going to have to beat Germany. The problem was that in autumn 1915, nobody wanted to concentrate there because it seemed futile. So they were all looking for alternatives to the Western Front. So the same group of men were also Easterners. And they divided. Some of them wanted Turkey, some of them wanted Salonika. There was a multitude of opinions. But you can identify three politicians and one soldierly splits with divisions within the key decision makers. McKenna, who was Chancellor, and Balfour, who was at the Admiralty, both favoured the old officially traditional British policy, the British way of war, as it's sometimes known, whereby we use the Navy to strangle the enemy on Europe and then use finance to enable other countries to do the fighting for us. This was essentially how Britain fought the Napoleonic Wars, and they wanted to repeat it. And it was the theory behind how Britain went to war in August 1914, just 100,000 soldiers. The problem with that was it would take too long. Germany was not heavily reliant on seabound exports. It got a lot of it internally. It wouldn't actually defeat Germany in any acceptable period of time. Kitchener took this strategy and ramped it up. He said, right, the job here is not just to defeat Germany. The job here is to defeat France after the war, in that he wanted Britain to be the strongest power on the continent of Europe when the war ended. In other words, to be more powerful than the French army. So he was going to build up a huge volunteer army, which he would sit on while the other countries fought it out, and then he'd take it into the fight in early 1917 to win the decisive victories. This also had an obvious flaw, mainly that the French were not prepared to just let the British build up an army while their boys were being shot at the front. So from 1915, mid-1915, the new armies were being fed across. So that strategy was also breaking down. Over in France, Sir John French and Douglas Haig saw it as a very simple matter. You broke through on the Western Front. And then you've got the group that are more usually called Easterners, which are made up of, you've got three men here and three different views, all linked by the idea that you could defeat Germany's allies, and that would weaken Germany to the point that they'd have to give in. But actually, Germany would have been strengthened in 1915 if Turkey had dropped out of the war, because they were propping up Turkey. Churchill favoured Gallipoli, as you'd expect. Lloyd George did not, although as an Easterner, he did favour going out east, but not to Gallipoli. He preferred the Balkans. Curzon represented quite a strong strand in the conservative part, or unionist part of the government. He was a keen imperialist and thought defence of Egypt and the Suez Canal was vital because it was the route to India, and so he too favoured fighting out in the Eastern Mediterranean. So although they were all Westerners, at this moment of time, they all, almost to a man, preferred to concentrate British military power more towards the eastern end of the Mediterranean. Not one of the cabinet favoured an out-and-out concentration on the Western Front as preferred by Robertson. Now, in July 1915, Robertson changes direction completely. He ceases working on operational method on the Western Front and concentrates on strategic matters. In particular, he starts lobbying key people in the political world for change. He starts writing letters to the King's equerries, both of whom he knows. Any politician that comes to the Western Front has his ear bent about how important it is to focus on the Western Front. Stories of Robertson being an inarticulate man are unwarranted. This is a man who forcefully argued his case to anybody who came to the Western Front. There was a regular trail of visitors out there. But the key moment was this meeting of the Dardanelles Committee in October 1915. This meeting was an emergency meeting called because of the German invasion of Serbia. So everybody was there, and a paper was presented by Archibald Murray, now the temporary acting chief of the Imperial General Staff, which was the first proper appraisal of the military situation that the politicians had ever seen. So that was a step forward. Unfortunately, Kitchener had nobbled it in advance, and he had an appendix. The problem with that was that whereas Murray's paper had argued very forcefully for a concentration on the Western Front, Kitchener's appendix proposed to send 8 divisions to Egypt. It didn't say so, but the implication was that they were earmarked for Gallipoli. The meeting descended into chaos, with all the politicians just arguing their fourpenneth as to where they'd send the 8 divisions. The 8 divisions themselves were mythical. They would have had to come out of France. Robertson was at the meeting. He was there as an expert on the Balkans, but he was also there because Asquith, I think, did it as a bit of a job interview to see whether Robertson was the man he wanted to be the next chief of the Imperial General Staff. When confronted with the question, Robertson was down the line. All troops should be focused on the Western Front. The 8 divisions should just stay where they were. This meant for Asquith, he'd got his man, not only a man with a clear opinion, but a man who could stand up to the politicians like Kitchener and Lloyd George. But Robertson's campaign went a step further after this meeting. He formed an informal alliance with Haig. Both men were deeply unhappy with the way the war was being fought, deeply unhappy with Sir John French, very unhappy with how it was organised in London. So they agreed on an alliance whereby Haig would campaign in London for Robertson to become chief of the Imperial General Staff, and Robertson in turn would campaign for Haig to replace Sir John French. And Haig was good as his word. He spent a week in London going from office to office and arguing the case for change. He was in fact pushing against an open door because Asquith was very keen to bring about change. In December 1915, Asquith's in tray was pretty full in terms of strategic considerations. He had the job of replacing Sir John French as Commander-in-Chief of the BEF, which was done on the 6th of December. He brought about a smaller, more efficient inner cabinet, the War Committee. This inner cabinet is very important because ultimately Britain, as a democratic nation, cannot fight a war as a one-man show in the end, because we're not ruled by an autocratic ruler. When Robertson mapped out his ideal, he looked at Germany. And in 1870, when the elder von Moltke had reported to the Kaiser, and the Kaiser alone, clearly that scenario wasn't available to Robertson in 1915. So Robertson looked at this new reduced war committee and thought, well, I can work to that. It's only 6 or 7 people. It's quite small, it's quite manageable. That will be his equivalent of the one-man show at the very top. So this small inner war committee was very important to Robertson's plans for the future. The next problem that Asquith had was the trickiest one of all. He had to sack the unsackable Kitchener. Kitchener was the personification of the war. The soldiers did not go to war for king and country. They were in Kitchener's army. And they had an intense loyalty to Kitchener, or K as he was known, particularly amongst the working class. And when there was a rumour in October 1915 that he'd been sacked, all hell broke out in the press, and Asquith was forced to deny the story. This presented him with a bit of a problem. So his short-term solution was to send him off to Gallipoli to do an inspection that wasn't necessary. It had already been done, in the hope that he'd stay out there and take a job in Egypt. But he didn't. He insisted on coming back. And when he telegraphed from Paris to London to say he was coming back, a mood of gloom settled over the cabinet meeting that was taking place when the news was announced. But Kitchener, when he landed at Greenwich, went straight to number 10 and handed in his notice and resigned. This was actually not what Asquith wanted at all. What Asquith wanted was an orderly transition. Robertson was also playing a problem for Asquith. Robertson was prepared to take the job, but only under his conditions, that there had to be a restructuring of how the decisions were taken and the responsibilities between the army and the politicians. Otherwise, he'd stay where he was. And he was also insisting on a recreation of the General Staff. That much Asquith was very keen on. But the creation of the position of a strong chief of the Imperial General Staff was more of a problem. So now we come to this thing called the Kitchener-Robertson Agreement. This pops up in the footnotes, sometimes gets mentioned in the pages in passing, but it was the anchor by which Robertson dominated British strategic policy for the rest of his time in office, because it had a legal underpinning that sustained his power or authority. So it's a very important piece of negotiation. Kitchener resigns. Asquith doesn't need this. He needs to persuade him, which he succeeds in doing, and said, go and see Robertson. We both want him to be chief of the Imperial General Staff, but he's got terms. Kitchener and Robertson meet at Kitchener's house. Robertson lays his cards on the table. He says, there is no place for you in this structure that I've got in front of me that I want to introduce. It's a one-man show and I'm the one man. Kitchener accepts that Robertson should be the new chief of Imperial General Staff, goes back to see Asquith, offers his resignation for a second time. Asquith again talks him out of it and says, go and see Robertson in France and have another conversation. They meet at Calais, travel by train to Paris to the Hotel Crillon, which I believe is still there, discussing matters as they go. Acting as a go-between at Kitchener's behest is Lord Esher, who carries the various iterations of the negotiation document backwards and forwards between Robertson sitting in his bedroom on the first floor and Kitchener brooding in the library, realizing that the last vestiges of his authority are being taken away from him. Robertson's terms are pretty clear. It's 2 pages of A4 document. So there's more to it than just these 3 points, but these are the 3 main ones. Robertson will be the sole military advisor. There will be no other advice to the government, including Kitchener. He would also issue all the orders. This, Robertson felt, was very important because it ensured that his orders carried authority over in France. Thirdly, he would control all the information that the cabinet saw. This is where he treads over the line into politics, because although Robertson conceded that the decision where the British Army should be located was a decision for the politicians, which the army would then implement, because he controlled the information, they could only really come up with an answer that he approved of. Now, this caused big problems for the government. All of the cabinet could see this as a major accretion of authority away from the government to the army. The army would control strategy. The big problem was that if Robertson issued the orders, he was not in the House of Commons or the House of Lords to answer for them. At the moment, Kitchener could do that. So a compromise was hatched up, whereby the orders were issued in Kitchener's name, but Robertson signed them. Now, this was obviously a bit of a loophole as far as Robertson was concerned. And so he and Kitchener reached a side deal known as our bargain, whereby Robertson would sign the orders over Kitchener's name, but Kitchener would never disagree in public or in the meetings with Robertson. All their discussions would be private. Kitchener called this our bargain and stuck to it until he drowned at sea in the middle of 1916. Robertson then went one stage further. Having got the politicians over a barrel, he insisted that he have what's known as an order in council, which locks in legally this agreement. Later in the year, when Lloyd George tried to undo this, he conceded that once the agreement was protected by an order in council, it was almost impossible to get rid of Robertson. He was a canny old blighter. Now we come on to those difficult years of him dealing with Lloyd George. 1916 was actually strategically, if not in pure military terms, a good year for the British Army. There was strategic consistency, normally considered a good thing, for the whole of the year. Robertson went to the War Committee at the end of December 1915 and persuaded them to commit to the Western Front. Later, at meetings in early January, he forced them to agree to a strategy of attrition, recognizing that that came with a cost in casualties. Then in April, with Haig alongside, and despite the objections of Lloyd George and to a lesser extent Balfour, Robertson was able to persuade the British government to let Haig have his offensive on the Somme in the middle of the summer. So 1916 was a good year. He was also able to claw back as many troops as he could from the other theatres dotted around the world. Obviously, Gallipoli was shut down completely. That process was underway before he took on the job of Chief of the Imperial General Staff. But Hellas Point was closed down at the end of December 1915. Egypt, in particular, was stripped bare. Kitchener was always overstocking or overstaffing Egypt. Robertson rightly concluded that with the Sinai Desert and the Suez Canal, you really didn't need much more than a division or so to hold the line in Egypt. His big failure was his inability to persuade the government to get out of Salonika. And he was on and on about it for the whole of his term in office. But however, obviously the problems did begin to mount up for him as the year went on and as Haig's attack stalled and stalled again. And in particular, he ran up against Lloyd George. Lloyd George was made War Minister on the death of Kitchener, and at the end of the year became Prime Minister. And so let's have a little word about him before we go back to Robertson. Lloyd George was an absolutely superb political operator. He was like the original Duracell bunny. He just went on and on. He always got his man, and he eventually got Robertson. The problem was he was a strategic numpty. Whereas he might be brilliant at domestic organisation of the economy and manpower sources in order to boost production within the country, he had limited understanding of military strategy, a terrible sense of geography. Even in 1918, he was unclear which was which, Australia or New Zealand, and had no understanding of the basic principle at the heart of Robertson's strategy, that it might be straightforward what he was proposing, a concentration on the Western Front, and correct, but it was also difficult. That principle, Lloyd George found hard to grasp. One area where he possibly was right, though, was that Britain was now a country at war, not just an army at war. And part of the problem between Lloyd George and Robertson lay that Lloyd George did appreciate that if it's the country at war, they needed sustenance with some kind of victories periodically just to keep morale up. And so often his desire to concentrate in particular with Allenby in Palestine was just to provide something to keep the people motivated to work in the factories, to work down the mines in the country at home. And Robertson didn't always appreciate that, and Haig never appreciated that. So at the heart also of Lloyd George's view of the world was that if you can imagine a Venn diagram with, on one side, sort of a BEF and leading the attack. The one thing, leading the attack in Europe, he never wanted that Venn diagram to overlap. He was happy for the BEF to lead attacks in Palestine or in Salonika or whatever, but he did not want the BEF to be leading attacks in France. He had no faith at all in Haig and Haig's team. And that meant he was quite happy to have the attack going forward in France, as long as the French did the lead and the BEF was in support. And that was why he agreed to the attack at Arras in spring of 1917. But his starting point was always anybody but the BEF in France. Now, the problem was that, of course, Robertson did not take that view at all. As far as Robertson was concerned, the strategy was settled. Therefore, these arguments that he was having with Lloyd George were pointless. The strategy was settled, and there was only one strategy. But it was made worse by, one has to say, by Robertson's failing to be able to get on with politicians. He didn't like them, he didn't trust them, he didn't trust the fact that they could change their opinions from day to day, something he never did, and could just speak on and on and on forever. They were just loquacious, pompous windbags, which was his description of Curzon. As a result, he tended to use quite minimalist tactics within the endless meetings that went on of the War Cabinet. Keeping his answers short, very brief. A politician would introduce a new idea and explain it at length, and Robertson would just mutter, "Well, I've heard different." Now, this as a tactic can work in the short term, but not in the long term. And over time, Robertson was eventually ran out of sort of supporters in the War Cabinet because of this minimalist approach. In the end, a chief of the Imperial General Staff has to get on with the Prime Minister. And if they don't, then it will break down. Churchill and Allenby both had terrible arguments with one another, but ultimately had faith in one another. Lloyd George and Robertson had no faith at all in one another. But Robertson's problems weren't just this difficult relationship with Lloyd George. It also wasn't that easy being Haig's man of business in London. I asked my tutor when I was writing my MI dissertation, who was the senior man, because I wasn't quite clear. My tutor replied, "That's a good question. When somebody answers, that's a good question, you should smell her out." He said, "That's a good question, but it didn't matter because they always agreed." This was not true. They didn't always agree. We've already seen how Roberts had a decidedly different approach to how to fight on the Western Front. But Robertson's difficulty with Haig was slightly more nuanced to the combative relationship with Lloyd George. Haig had completely unrealistic expectations of what Robertson could achieve. He expected Robertson to just tell the politicians what to do, and that would be the end of it. In reality, Robertson could never do that. If the whole War Cabinet agreed to shift 2 divisions to Italy, then he had to do it. And over time, Haig lost faith in Robertson and felt that he wasn't doing enough to protect his own position. And Haig was also difficult and duplicitous in his relationship with his man in London. Early in 1916, just as Robertson is explaining to the politicians that the army must use attrition, Haig is writing a policy note saying that attrition won't work and the BEF has to seek a breakthrough. He was also quite duplicitous. In April, at the meeting when they approved the Somme offensive, Haig said, "I will be cautious and conservative." And within 24 hours of leaving the meeting, he's telling Rawlinson to make his plans more ambitious. And it was that decision to make those plans more ambitious was probably the biggest single reason why for the calamity of July the 1st. Robertson was not commander-in-chief. He was a general, a full general. Haig was a field marshal. Lloyd George thought that Robertson's inability to rein Haig in was down to class deference. It wasn't. Robertson was afraid of no man, but there was rank involved, and Robertson, as a believer in the army, believed in rank, and Haig was the ranking man. And in fact, when he was made Field Marshal, Robertson opposed the appointment because he realized there would be a seniority issue. So all he could do to influence Haig was letters, sometimes just to Rawlinson or Kigel over in France. He couldn't order him about. And that was something, again, that the politicians didn't really understand. Over time, there were these divisions between Robertson and Haig began to show themselves, and that's what we'll come on to next. I'm not going to go through all of this lot. There's more than this. This is just the highlights. The key event really was the failure of the Nivelle offensive. Robert Nivelle was appointed French commander-in-chief at the end of 1915. He promised a swift victory and end to the war. He felt that his attacks in Verdun at the end of that battle had shown the way to defeat the Germans. He was very persuasive. He was very persuasive in London, where he spoke good English, and because his mother was English, and he fitted Lloyd George's bill perfectly. Here was a man who was going to lead the attack. He was French and not British, and he had a plan to win the war quickly. And so Lloyd George conspired at a conference in Calais in February 1917 to place the British army permanently under the control of the French. Robertson famously rebelled at this plan and forged a compromise, which meant that the British were temporarily under the command of the French, and that's why they launched the attack at Arras. But the other part of the deal was that if the attack failed, then Haig could have his preferred choice of an offensive at Ypres granted. Now, of course, the Nivelle offensive was a spectacular failure, and the French troops mutinied and effectively ceased to fight for most of 1917. In May, Robertson, with Haig alongside, were able to exploit Lloyd George's weakness and get agreement to the principle of an attack at Ypres later that summer. There were then a series of planning meetings where they really crawled all over the detail, and Lloyd George searched desperately for a reason to cancel the attack, which he did not want to go ahead, but could find no reason to. At that point, the British were really the only force in the field against the Germans. He also spotted that there was a difference in the appreciations between Haig and Robertson. And he had good reason to think that. Robertson never liked Ypres. He favoured the attack at Messines Ridge and Witchett, but not further north. He thought the lines were too difficult. The countryside was too difficult. They were too overlooked. He also thought that Haig's idea of reaching as far as the Belgian coast was completely fanciful. Lloyd George did his best to price them apart, but completely failed. Lloyd George stuck by Haig, and the attack went on. It is one of the mysteries of 1917 just why Lloyd George or Robertson were unable to rein Haig in. Neither really tried, and that has to be seen as a bit of a black mark against both men. But the strategic landscape began to shift as the year went on. It was clear by mid-1917, or late 1917, sorry, that the attack at Ypres was going to fail. The situation was then made worse by the disappointment of Cambrai. It was the fact that Cambrai had this instant success and then failure, which really did make the BEF's reputation reach a new nadir in London. Even Lord Curzon, probably the most resolute supporter of the soldiers, started being critical. There were a host of changes in the management structure in the BEF. Out went the head of intelligence, out went the chief of staff, out went several corps commanders. And there's no doubt Lloyd George wanted want Haig. He couldn't get that, but he'd settle for out with Robertson. Now, the way he engineered it was that he brought about a breakdown of the Kitchener-Robertson agreement. In the autumn of 1917, he persuaded the War Cabinet that he should take some outside consultations from independent expert people about British strategy. And he chose Henry Wilson and Sir John French, two men, neither of whom were exactly unbiased. Wilson obviously wanted Robertson's job, and French was bitter at Haig ousting him. Wilson had been back in London since the summer and been openly going around London saying that unless he got given a good job, he was just going to make mischief. And Wilson was the kind of man who appealed to Lloyd George. He loved politicians. He loved their company. He was very easy company himself. He also let go little hints that he favoured alternatives to the Western Front, all of which were big ticks as far as Lloyd George was concerned. But he also came up with a solution to a genuine problem that Lloyd George had, and that was unity of command across the Western, or across the fronts in Western Europe. Lloyd George's view was that the front from Italy right the way to the Belgian coast was a single front. And you should move your resources as you saw fit across the whole of the front. And his expectation was that the portion of the front you would never focus on was the British bit. Robertson also favoured much more unity of command, but he was a tad xenophobic about the French. I mean, even though he spoke perfectly fluent French, although it had a hefty Lincolnshire accent in it, he never spoke French in meetings with the French. He had it translated just to make sure he knew what they were saying. And so he was very suspicious of the French, but also appreciated that in the weakened condition the French army was in, the likelihood was that British resources would be weakened, because he knew that in all probability, any unified commander would be French. But Wilson's solution was to come up with this thing, the Supreme War Council, which would include members from the Italians, the French, the British, and the Americans when they came across too. And there would be a representative from each. And these would unify the offensive strategy on the Western Front, and would also possibly, this was never in the end agreed, manage the strategic reserve. It was clearly a stepping stone towards unified command. And it broke pretty much every rule that Robertson had. In particular, with Wilson in Versailles at the Supreme War Council and him in London, there were two men in the show. The Supreme War Council was never, on Lloyd George's part, a serious attempt to unify command. The gentleman on the right is the Supreme War Council in 1918, and I don't think any of you will know who any of them are. You might know one or two of them. Essentially, as soon as Robertson was ousted, the Supreme War Council was sidelined. It was a vehicle that enabled Lloyd George to get rid of Robertson. This was a protracted negotiation with a series of propositions, but Robertson effectively boxed himself in a corner by sticking so resolutely to this principle of it being a one-man show. Even though he was offered the job at the Supreme War Council if Wilson took over from him. In the end, on February 16th, 1918, he felt forced to resign on principle. Shortly before he resigned, Lloyd George went to see Haig, and he wanted to make sure that if Robertson was ousted, there'd be no objections from Haig, because if Haig objected, Robertson probably couldn't get rid, Lloyd George probably couldn't get rid of Robertson. Haig listened to what the Prime Minister had to say, and by then he felt Robertson was no longer properly sticking up for him in France. He was allowing divisions to go to Italy. He wasn't keeping the politicians in line, and realizing that it could possibly be a choice between him or Robertson, he was quite happy to let Robertson leave office. Now, Lloyd George, not utterly heartless, realized that Robertson had no income other than his army salary, suggested that given his seniority and his experience, he should be given a corps command, but Haig vetoed it. Haig wanted Robertson's ability in London. He didn't want him amongst his commanders, which brings me on to this last slide. This is a quote from the Haig diary, February 1916. It's not in either of the two compilations, which I think is a shame, because it's very indicative of Haig's opinion of probably his most important single colleague. But clearly he wanted his ability. He wanted Robertson to do stuff, but he didn't want to work with him. He didn't want a lower middle class man with his bad accent and his dropped H's in the same room as him. He wanted gentlemen. Now, you also get a little bit of a hint, because there are other hints, that Robertson was a little bit full of himself. I'll do this, I'll do that. You know, he was quite, very strong-minded man, and he would not have been easy for Haig to manage. And you have to remember that Haig liked a quiet office, nobody objecting. And we can be reasonably certain that had Robertson stayed as Chief of Staff, he would not have gone along happily with some of the decisions that Haig took. And I finish with this story. A year after the war ended, Lord Milner, who'd been in the war cabinet, held a party to celebrate at his house, and all the leading generals were invited. Haig gave a speech and thanked everybody, but he went out of his way to very long-windedly thank Henry Wilson for his contribution from being Chief of the Imperial General Staff, although Wilson had only been in the position for February, and much of his authority was taken by Foch when he became the commander of the forces or the coordinator. Didn't mention Robertson at all. As they were leaving the room, Robertson's old sort of aide-de-camp, a chap called Colonel Lucas, came alongside and turned to Robertson and said, "Oh, what do you think of that? That wasn't very fair, was it?" To which Robertson replied, "I'll never go farting with Haig again." Now, this story is quite indicative in three ways. First of all, it's in character. Robertson was very fond of using the language of the ranks to emphasize his points and rather shock people by the words he used. So it's in character. But I suspect it's a deliberate miss here, that this is a man who's still got the vestiges of a Lincolnshire accent. And I think he actually said, "I'll never go fighting with Haig again." The story comes from Liddell Hart's voluminous correspondence, and he used to meet the official historian, Sir John Edmonds, in his club. And I'm sure they sat there in 1931, which is when this story was told, laughing and guffawing at Wully and how about his Lincolnshire accent and how funny that was. But in many ways, it also indicates a little bit about how they slightly patronised him, out of his hearing. Robertson died in 1933, aged 73. Shortly before he died, he went for a walk around St James's Park with Sir John Edmonds, and he did say that the only regret in what had obviously been an extraordinary career was that he'd never commanded a division in the field. Right, thank you very much. That is the end of the talk. And while Andy draws together any questions you might have. This is a little bit of a bibliography. It's not a well-covered subject, and many of the books are at the upper end of the price range. But I would single out three. The primer, if you like, the starting point, is David Woodward's Lloyd George and the Generals, which does cover the period a little bit before Lloyd George comes to power. When Lloyd George is in power, David Frenches the strategy of the Lloyd George coalition, which is not just looking at military, but looking at, in many ways, what was the biggest single strategic issue, which wasn't where to fight at all. It was actually the biggest single strategic issue was how to balance the needs of the various competing forces for manpower, which is obviously an argument which Robertson was really only on the edge of. And third book I'd recommend is George Cassar, who does mount something of a defence of Asquith as war leader. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ross. And if in the traditions of the webinar audience, if you'd like to raise your hands to just acknowledge what's been a tour de force, I think, in terms of Robertson's life and career. So yes, lots of people thanking you for your contribution tonight, Ross. And we've got several questions. So Alan Atkins asks, I've always been intrigued as to how a lieutenant, working class and commissioned from the ranks, got to marry a general's daughter.
I'm so glad you asked that. It was something I edited out in order to get the thing down to an appropriate time. Robertson was a stern writer. All his letters are short and sharp. And there's two exceptions. One of the letters to his father about becoming an officer, and his terribly soppy Mills and Boonsey letters to Mildred. They really are quite sentimental. His wife was a colonel's daughter in Simla, and her family thoroughly opposed the marriage, the proposed marriage. And in particular, Mildred's sister was very much against it. But Robertson was based in Simla and basically just launched a charm offensive, going to meet the family continually. And he went on also on this expedition, which got him huge plaudits on his own, where he was essentially walking around the Afghan borders all on his own with just a couple of bearers, which also got a huge brownie points, if you like, with the family. Eventually, he was able to persuade them, and they got on famously thereafter. And I always think the irony of the picture I had right at the start is that she was a colonel's daughter. He was, at that time, a captain, actually, not a lieutenant. But the expectation of an ex-ranker was that they get to about major before they ran out of time. So one of their objections would have been, but he's only going to become a major, he's never going to become a colonel. But as that picture at the front shows, Robertson didn't just get to major, he went way up, way higher than his father-in-law ever went. So there was a nice sort of irony that Mildred is sitting there with the king and queen, which was something her family would have never dreamt of when he was courting her back in Simla in 1895.
Thank you for that. Thank you, Alan. Mo Dewar. Before enlisting, he worked as Lord Raglan's groom. True.
Correct. Correct, yes. True. He did 3 jobs as a footman. First, you know how they said, how important a teacher is when you're at school. The vicar in Wellborn is central to the Robertson story, and he helped him make that crucial decision. He was a confidant at all times, and his first job after leaving school was essentially as a footman in the vicar's house. He then went and worked in Lord Raglan's house, and it's been supposed that all the military paraphernalia around the house gave him the idea of joining the army. He then went over to Worcester, but in one of his few moments of sort of self-reflection, he did once confess to a young officer that he was a damn bad footman. I suspect he was quite good. He was in build. If you look at the pictures, he was described as a perambulating refrigerator. He had extraordinarily strong, large upper body, which I'm sure when he was bolt erect just looked fantastic. Yes. So yes, he was a footman, although allegedly not a good one.
Another true or false. Horace, you're for home. Was this a true saying?
Good again. Horace, you're for home. Allegedly true, but I think not. For those that don't know the story, when Sir John French decides he finally wants to get rid of Horace Smith-Dorrien as the in charge of the Second Army at the time, and fires him. The story is that he gets Robertson to do the dirty. Robertson goes and sees Smith-Dorrien. Smith-Dorrien is out in the field, in the trenches, and he goes up to him and says, "You're for home, Horace," with no H in either home or Horace. And again, there are more stories, I think, about Robertson, usually based around class, than all the other generals added up, more little anecdotes. And I think this one turns up after the war. I think it would have been completely out of character for Robertson to dismiss Smith-Dorrien in the public hearing of another person. It would have just not been his way. He would have taken Smith-Dorrien aside and told him man to man, because he knew the man well. He toured Belgium. He was, he was a good acquaintance, stroke friend. He wouldn't have done that, not in the hearing of the chap who has told the story after the war. I think there's a heavy dose of apocryphal about that story. Personal view.
Thank you. And that was from Malcolm Sperring-Toy. Thank you, Malcolm. Barry Johnson coming in from the States, Ross. With Robertson as CIGS and Kitchener as Secretary of State for War, did Britain briefly have the best of both worlds?
Well, I think so, yeah. I mean, it did rely, the thing with Kitchener, it was never challenged. He went down on the HMS Hampshire in, I think it's June 1916. So the strategy of relentless focus on the Western Front was never put to the test with Kitchener there. He went down before things started going squiffy, and so we'll never know. But he stuck strictly to it, our bargain, for those 6 months, and he was very fond of saying it. They had several fallouts at the start, always about Egypt, but he did stick to his word. We'll never know. But 1916 worked because, as you know, in almost anything, you get a bit of grace period when you start a new strategy, and so they got a grace period. They'd gone through a pretty rigorous process of agreeing the strategy in January, February. They gave Haig his head in July. They had to give it a period of time before they started querying it. So for all sorts of reasons, the army got a good run in 1916. And by the autumn as well, Asquith's eye was off the ball. And obviously it all changed. It all really changed with Lloyd George. I think that's the key change, not the Kitchener-Lloyd George, Kitchener-Robertson partnership, as it were.
Thank you. And if you can hold any more questions, we've got enough to see us through, I think, this evening. Okay, Gordon Holmes. Throughout British military history, would you say that the British Army class structure and financial requirements prevented many capable and intelligent men from progressing through the officer ranks?
This will surprise you. No.
All right.
I think I quoted the figures. There's a very good book by Edward Spears about Victorian Army, Manchester University Press, which deals with this far more detailed than I could. But partly because the army was low status in the early part of the 19th century, quite a few ex-rankers came through. 23% in the 1830s of officers were ex-rankers. Strictly speaking, the sale of commissions was actually, or the sale of what were called aggregated payments, were associated payments, sorry, were illegal, because what you do is you'd sell your commission, but you'd also sell your rank. So if somebody wanted to go from major to colonel, you could do a deal. Essentially, over time, the army became higher status, and the number of ex-rankers coming through, once competitive exams were introduced by Cardwell in 1871, actually reduced. So the introduction of competitive exams, far from opening up the gates to bright young ex-rankers, did have the reverse. It actually they got fewer and fewer. And even as progressive a general as Ian Hamilton was saying in the early 1900s, that actually the soldiers themselves didn't like being commanded by ex-rankers. Now, my cynical view of that is that's because the ex-rankers would know their tricks and they would find it easier to trick a toff. But what did happen undoubtedly was that the officer class just got older and older, because all you could do was wait for your pension. You couldn't sell your position. So there was nothing at all. But it wasn't helped by the fact that the Duke of Cambridge, who was Commander-in-Chief of the British Army up until 1895, fiercely opposed competitive exams. And so as he couldn't have purchase of commissions, he did everything on a strict seniority basis, as far as he possibly could. And that also just made it dead man's shoes. So all in all, actually, by the late 1800s, the British Army, in its top tiers, was in a bit of a state. And it's a bit of a mystery to me, bearing in mind they were fighting in a war every year except 1883, I think, how they managed to win them all.
I jump on to Peter Newham's question now, Ross. Was there any evidence from Robertson's writings and or correspondence that he was unnaturally ambitious?
Oh, yes. Unnaturally or naturally?
Unnaturally.
No. He was avowedly and definitely ambitious. He was the family's favoured child. When in 1885, when he's angsting over whether he should become an officer, in the letters to his father, he says, as you know, I am very ambitious. And it was always a firm point. But he, as an ex-ranker, he would have only got to major before he ran out of time, normally. He is absolutely an exception to get as high as he did, and it's because he went down the specialist route of intelligence. The people, most of his peers, the public school boys, wanted to be in the cavalry and whatnot, and the fashionable regiments. He was pretty unusual in seeking a route up General Staff, and that enabled him to further his ambitions. I think it's pretty ambitious on any person's part to say, as he did in 1915, that basically he knew what was needed in London and he was the man to do it. The decision he took, I mean, I've not seen him write this, but it's evident that he looked around him in France and in London and looked at his peers and said, well, I'm the only man who can sort these politicians out. And that's pretty ambitious. Yeah.
Okay. John Salmon asks, are you aware of anyone who might be compiling an up-to-date biography of WR? If so, any idea when it's due out?
Who knows? The answer to that is me and who knows. I started, there is only one biography, proper biography, that's Victor Bonham Carter's Soldier True, written in 1962, dated, and there's all sorts of stuff not in it. There's none of the correspondence about how he angsted over the commission. It's a very imperfect book, but it's all we've got. There's a military biography, which by David Woodward, which is really just a cut and paste version of his Lloyd George and the Generals. I set out 4 years ago to work on a Robertson biography, and COVID has completely kiboshed it. I've just not been able to get near the archives really now for the best part of 2 years. I'm due to restart. I might make it before I die. I don't know. I'm going to do my best.
Interesting question from Tony Stiles. Going back to your last slide before the bibliography, why do you think on the last slide that the points you raised were missing from the Sheffield and Bourne's?
I don't know. I mean, I should ask somebody. I mean, clearly, if you look at the diaries, I mean, they're fantastic. The Haig diaries are a fantastic document. You just have to take your hat off to a man who, in the midst of the most stressful situation imaginable, can sit down and write these diaries, page after page, of beautifully crafted words. You know, his ability to verbally reason was phenomenal on paper. That means that Sheffield and Bourne have got the most humongous job of editing it down. The Sheffield and Bourne book is specifically his military correspondence, and this, you could argue, doesn't fit that brief. So, for example, the letters between Haig and Robertson, where they agree to campaign on one another's behalf, is in the Blake version, but not in Smith and Bourne, Sheffield and Bourne, because it's not military, pure military. I mean, they are so big, something had to go. I think it's a shame. They actually, I found them, they're in the biography of, I only knew about it because there's a biography of Douglas Haig by a chap called Gerald de Groot. It pops up there. And you look at it through the Haig lens, but actually it's saying a little bit of something about Robertson too.
2 to go. Thank you. What was Robertson's views on the quality of junior leadership? You know, company commanders in the BES.
Yeah, I'm not sure I can give a generalized answer to that. I can only, not a straight answer that says he thought they were good, he thought they were bad. What did vex him considerably was profligacy with what he thought was a valuable resource. It's probably the most continual repeating theme of his letters of the documents he produces in 1915 as Chief of Staff is, look after your officers. You're wasting your officers. These are a valuable asset. They're difficult to replace. You know, he writes to Wigram and the King's Equerry in Stamford and saying, you know, officers are really good officers, are very short supply, and we're losing too many. We're wasting them. So it's not a direct answer because I don't think I can give that. I don't think I know enough. But I just know he treated them as this extremely valuable asset. And it was one of his criticisms of the attempts to create a breakthrough, was that it just threw away officers that had to be then trained up and replaced. And that wasn't something you could do very easily. No, that's a consistent theme, was preserve, you know, you couldn't preserve them. That was fairly obvious, but you just shouldn't waste this asset. That was his view. I'm putting slightly words into his mouth there.
John Casey said, I did my MA on Smith Dorrien as Army Commander. I agree that the Oratio for Home story is apocryphal. This is from David Muir, many, but not all, generals were raised to the peerage after World War I, but not Robertson. Was this part of Lloyd George's hate campaign against him?
Can I say the people asking questions are very good at picking up the bits that I cut out, because I wanted to get the lecture down to an hour or so. The only source I have for this is Wikipedia. So it comes with a huge caveat that this is where it's come. The story allegedly is this. Churchill, as Minister of Munitions, got on well with Robertson when Robertson was made commander of the Army of the Rhine in 1919 and wanted to make him Field Marshal. Lloyd George vetoed it, still cross about those 2 years of bitter arguments. But what Churchill really wanted to do was to send Robertson to Ireland to deal with the troubles there. I think that would have been a very bad move. But Lloyd George vetoed sending Robertson to Ireland. So Churchill rewarded him by upping him to Field Marshal, which was something that Lloyd George did not favour at all. but it went through anyway, because Lloyd George was actually very chummy with the royal family. He had spent quite a bit of time before the war acting as the escort. You know, when the king or the queen, king and queen visited events, it was often him who took them around when he was commandant of the Staff College. And it was the king who made the appointment of him to be a Field Marshal over Lloyd George's disapproval.
Yeah, Ted Green asks, do we have any information on George V's view?
Oh, they got on very well. They got on very well. There's a nice little picture in the paper, in one of the old newspapers, of him showing around, and Robertson looks as pleased as Punch to be showing the king around. At one point, at the height of the crisis in 1915, George visited the front. He meets Robertson, and Lord King George puts a straight question to Robertson, you know, how good is Sir John French? Is he any good? And Robertson, being loyal, decides to stick up for his boss and prevaricates around the issue. But in the end, he can't do it. And he just gives the king 2 barrels worth on how terrible Sir John French is as a commander. They got on very well. But Robertson was aware that in any standoff with the king between him and Haig, as it could possibly have come to in 1917, 1918, then the king would have batted for Haig, not for Robertson. Haig was really in with the royal family.
Yeah, sure. The final question is from Charles Fair. I suspect that Robertson, or Robertson plus Haig, were behind the setting up of the officer cadet battalion system in an ACI of February 16, but have not been able to prove it. Have you come across anything?
I haven't got that far. Chronologically, I haven't got that far in my researches, I have to say. When COVID came along, I'd got to about 1915. So I can't answer that one, I'm afraid.
Okay, if Charles comes back to us, we can sort of come back to that later on. Okay, so I think, you know, there's still quite a lot of people involved. On behalf of everybody, Ross, let me just quote David Thompson. Says, great talk, well researched and presented using super slides. Ross has given us a thoroughly enjoyable evening, for which I'm not alone in thanking him wholeheartedly. Ross, I can say no.
Thank you very much.
I've enjoyed it very much the second time round. So thank you, everybody. Ross, thanks again for a great evening, and thank you all for joining, and we look forward to you being part of whichever webinar you join next. Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Good night.
Bye, everybody, and thank you very much.
Good night, Ross.
Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous. Mademoiselle from Armentières,